The light in the old room flicked on, revealing a single photograph Paul Newman had hidden for decades. Pier Angeli's smile, frozen in a past he never escaped. No one understood why he kept it. Not until his final days, when a close friend whispered he never forgot her. Not for a second. Their first love had been crushed by Hollywood's demands, torn between duty and desire, and it haunted him until his last breath. But what truly happened between Paul Newman and Pier Angeli? To understand that photograph, you have to go back to the moment when everything looked perfect. Before the legend, before the charities, and the blue eyes on movie posters, Paul Newman was just a young actor standing in the shadows of a soundstage, watching a girl walk into the light. Her name was Pier Angeli. Hollywood described her as the girl who glows, a fragile beauty from Italy, with eyes that seemed always one breath away from tears. She was the dream the studios wanted to sell. Innocence with a halo, sadness with lipstick. He noticed the sadness first. In the early 1950 seconds, Paul was still fighting to be seen. He had served in the Navy, gone back to school, and arrived in New York with a face casting directors called Too Clean, Too Polite, Too Pretty for Villains, Not Rough Enough for Heroes. He had a wife, Jackie, and a young family. Respectable, solid, ordinary. Hollywood was not built for ordinary. When their paths crossed, it wasn't a grand, orchestrated meeting. No thunder, no spotlight, just a corridor at a studio, the smell of cigarettes and makeup powder, and a girl standing alone near a door, clutching a script to her chest as if it were armor. Someone introduced them, a name, a handshake, a half smile. He thought she looked like someone who carried too much memory for her age. She thought he looked like someone who didn't quite believe he belonged where he was. On paper, they were both in the right place at the right time. In reality, they were already trapped. Pier had arrived in Hollywood carrying more than suitcases. She brought with her a strict Catholic mother, a different language, and the unspoken rule that a girl's heart was never really hers alone. Every decision, from the roles she took to the men she saw, passed through other hands first. Paul came with another kind of weight, a marriage, children, expectations of being a good man in a world that rewarded men who were anything but. Hollywood didn't care about any of that. It only cared about what happened when the camera turned on. On set, Pier learned to smile on cue, to cry on cue, to fall in love on cue, with partners chosen for her. Directors praised her as pure emotion. She hit her marks perfectly. She made audiences believe. Off set, she rarely believed anything lasted. Paul was different, quieter, less glamorous than the men she was usually paired with. He listened more than he spoke, watched more than he performed. When he laughed, it was small, almost apologetic, like someone who had spent too long trying not to take up too much space. What began between them was not thunderous. It was subtle. A shared coffee in the studio cafeteria, a conversation about being far from home, a joke about how Hollywood made people pretend to be alive under lights while they secretly felt more and more numb. He understood the loneliness of being surrounded by people and still feeling invisible. She understood the fear of disappointing everyone except herself. Little by little, the illusion started to form. From the outside, it looked like any friendly connection on a film set. Two young actors, both beautiful, both rising, drawn into the same orbit. The press, if they noticed at all, saw it as harmless. If they had taken a photograph, it would have looked innocent. A glance, a smile, a moment between rehearsals. But the people on the inside noticed the pauses. The way Pier relaxed when Paul was near, as if the tension dropped from her shoulders for a few minutes. The way Paul's eyes followed her when she walked away, as if the scene wasn't over for him yet. Nothing happened. Not in the way gossip magazines like to print. There were no stolen kisses in parking lots, no dramatic scenes in restaurants, no public fights. Instead, there were conversations too long to be casual, silences too comfortable to be professional, and a kind of careful distance that only appears when two people know exactly what could happen if they get too close. He had a ring on his finger. She had a mother in her ear. And above them, the studio watched, counting money. Hollywood, in those years, loved a good love story on screen and hated a complicated one off screen. There were contracts, morals clauses, publicity plans. The right romance could sell a movie. The wrong one could end a career. Pier's image had been polished to perfection, European, delicate, devout. Paul was still being shaped, earnest, solid, reliable, the dozing kind of man audiences could trust. A man who left his wife for a young starlet would not be trustworthy. A young Catholic actress who tangled herself with a married man would not be devout. The rules were simple and cruel, so the feelings had nowhere to go except inward. They met in dressing rooms, corridors, cafe corners. They talked about work, about scripts, about the oddness of pretending to be in love with people they barely knew, while the person they actually wanted to talk to was sitting just out of frame. There is a particular kind of bond that forms when two people are both trapped by different versions of the same machine. He told her about auditions that went nowhere, about feeling like the wrong kind of man in the right kind of town. She told him about waking up some mornings and forgetting which language her dreams had been in. He made her laugh. She made him honest. No scandal, no confession, just an accumulation of moments that began to feel more real than anything the cameras captured. And then Hollywood did what it always does when it senses a story it cannot control. It wrote another one on top of it. For Pier, that meant new partners, new headlines, new calculated matches. Names that looked better on paper, men who fit the mold, choices that made sense to everyone except the two hearts actually involved. For Paul, it meant being pulled back into the gravity of his life, his wife, his children, his struggle to be both ambitious and loyal in a system that rewarded ambition and punished loyalty when the two collided. They did not declare anything. They did not end anything. There was nothing official to end. Instead, there were decisions. Pier was encouraged toward men who matched her Catholic upbringing, her continental image, her marketable fragility. She was told what was good for her career, what would protect her reputation, what her mother would accept. Paul was reminded of his responsibilities. He was not a bachelor. He was not free. He had made promises long before he knew what Hollywood would demand of him. In another life, another city, without cameras, maybe things would have broken differently. In this one, under these lights, duty always arrived first, so the illusion stayed intact. To the public, Paul Newman moved through the 1,950 seconds as a promising actor on the rise, with a family behind him and a whole career ahead. Pier Angeli appeared in magazines as a tragic, luminous starlet, photographed on the arms of men the studio approved, walking red carpets she never chose the direction of. Their names were rarely printed together. Their story was lived in the spaces between articles, between frames, between choices they didn't quite make and choices that were made for them. If you look at the photographs from that era, you won't see a scandal. You will see a young man learning how to wear his own face in front of a camera. You will see a young woman smiling at flashes that made her eyes water. What you will not see is the quiet understanding that passed between them in hallways where no one was photographing anything. In conversations where the only audience was the fear that they were about to cross a line they could never uncross, Hollywood protected its illusion. The golden couple Paul would later form with Joanne Woodward, the tragic roles Pier would play. The narratives assigned to each of them all looked clean, complete, satisfying. But under the surface, something unfinished remained. A first love that never officially began. A choice that was never officially made. A story that, on paper, does not exist. And yet, years later, in an old room, there was still that photograph. The girl with the soft eyes, the man who walked away because the script of his life had already been written. They were the illusion before the legend, the calm before the wound, and the secret that would not let him go. The hidden truth did not begin with a scandal. It began with a choice, not the loud kind, the quiet kind that looks reasonable to everyone except the two people it destroys. For Pier Angeli, that choice came with a ring she did not truly want. The headline said she had found the perfect match, a crooner, a Catholic, a man who looked right beside her in photographs. Magazines printed their smiles as proof. Paul Newman did not appear in those photographs. He was somewhere else. On another set, holding a script in his hands and pretending it did not shake. People like to believe heartbreak happens in one moment. One fight, one betrayal, one decisive scene. In reality, theirs happened slowly. A series of postponed conversations, a handful of phone calls never made. 1,000 thoughts swallowed back because they did not fit the roles they had been given. She had been told all her life that love should look a certain way, respectable, religious, approved. He had been told that a good man honors his vows, even if those vows had been written before he fully understood what his heart could do. So when Pier agreed to marry someone else, Hollywood exhaled. The studio executives relaxed. Her mother slept better. The narrative finally made sense. Everyone was relieved. Everyone except the two people who actually had to live with that decision. According to friends, Pier's smile on her wedding day looked perfect in the photographs. But in the quiet moments, when no one was fixing her hair or adjusting her dress, she went still. "Are you happy?" a bridesmaid asked. She said yes, because by then she knew how to act. Paul did not attend the wedding. He was never expected to. He was the married man who had been just a friend. But word travels in small circles. He heard the news between takes. Someone mentioned it casually, a joke, a headline, a piece of trivia. The world said, "Good for her." Something in him went silent. He did not throw anything. He did not storm out of the set. He did what he had done all his life. When pain came too close, he folded it, put it away, buried it under work. This was the hidden truth. Their tragedy was not a forbidden affair. It was an unfinished love that both of them kept trying to outgrow. Pier tried first. Her marriage looked correct. It ticked every box. Yet even in the early days, the cracks were there. She wanted a tender listener, a man who saw through the surface. Instead, she found herself standing beside someone who loved the idea of her more than the person she was when the makeup came off. In private, she spoke of the other one, the man who had made her feel understood, the man she had not chosen. Friends recalled that she would bring up Paul's name lightly, then fall into a brief, raw silence, as if listening for a version of her life where she had said no to everyone else and yes to him. At the same time, Paul was building his own illusion of stability. He devoted himself to work. He went home to a wife and children. He told himself that what he felt for Pier had been nothing more than a passing tenderness. Then, late at night, when the house was quiet and the day's performances were over, he would remember her face in doorways, in corridors, in the small spaces where they had dared to be honest for a few minutes. This is the part biographies do not fully capture, the way a person can be faithful in action and unfaithful in thought, the way you can keep every promise and still feel like a traitor to your own heart. Years moved, careers climbed, dipped, climbed again. Paul Newman's name began to matter. Scripts improved. Directors listened. Audiences memorized his eyes. Pier's story moved in the opposite direction. Hollywood, which had once called her a miracle, began to lose interest. New actresses arrived. New faces, new obsessions. The camera, cruel and indifferent, drifted away. The hidden truth is that success and failure do not erase love. They only change the way a person carries it. For Paul, success gave him distractions. For Pier, disappointment stripped hers away. She had more time to think, more empty hours between jobs, more quiet moments where old choices came back like ghosts sitting at the end of the bed. Some nights, according to people close to her, she would listen to records and go very still when his name appeared in a magazine or in the credits on television. She never changed the channel. There are stories of letters, not love letters in the traditional sense. Fragments, notes, words written then folded away. A line about not being able to forget someone who never really belonged to you. A line about feeling like life had split in two and she had followed the wrong track. A confession that in another world she would have chosen differently. Whether Paul ever saw those letters is a question no one can answer with certainty, but there is one thing people close to him agree on. Whenever Pier's name came up, he did not joke. He did not dodge. He went quiet. Joanne Woodward, years later, would become the woman the world believed held his entire heart. And in many ways, she did. But there are kinds of love that do not compete. They occupy different rooms in the same house. Joanne was the life he ultimately built. Pier was the door he never fully closed. The hidden truth is that a man can be devoted and haunted at the same time. He carried guilt about his first wife, about his children, about his failures as a father. He carried shame about his drinking. He carried doubts about his own worth. Underneath all of that, quieter but persistent, he carried a question. What if I had fought for her? No one heard him say it. He was too careful for that. But it was there in the way he looked at certain photographs, in the way he dismissed certain questions too quickly, in the way his voice would thin out when the conversation drifted toward the old days. Pier, meanwhile, was collapsing in slow motion. Her marriage did not save her. The roles did not save her. The applause did not save her. Hollywood has a way of using fragile people as decoration until it no longer needs them. Then it forgets to ask whether they can survive the silence. She struggled with her mental health, with loneliness, with the feeling that her best scenes had been left on a cutting room floor no one would ever see. Behind every public appearance, there were private nights that did not make it into any script. Nights where she replayed choices, nights where she wondered if she had been cowardly, nights where she tried to imagine what a life with Paul would have looked like, then stopped because it hurt too much. The tragedy is not that they were kept apart by villains. There was no one person to blame, not the studio, not the church, not the spouses. The real villain was fear, fear of scandal, fear of hurting people, fear of stepping out of the safe narrative and into one that might burn everything down. So they stayed in their assigned roles. He became the principled star with a steady gaze. She became the tragic footnote in other people's stories. And still, somewhere inside both of them, the same unfinished scene kept playing. Two young actors in a hallway, a simple conversation, a feeling neither of them dared to name. Years later, when Paul stood in his kitchen with that old photograph in his hands, that was the scene that returned. Not the headlines, not the rumors, not the neon tragedy of how her life ended. Just a girl with tired eyes, just a boy who already knew he was going to walk away. The hidden truth was never about scandal. It was about the cost of choosing the life that looks right over, the love that feels true. He built a family. He built a legacy. He gave away millions to charity. He tried to be a better husband, a better man, a better father. And yet, on some quiet days, the weight of that one lost possibility pressed on him like a hand on his chest. Not enough to break him, just enough to remind him there are people you lose by accident. And there are people you lose because you decided to be good. Those are the ones who haunt you. Pier Angeli became that for him. Not a scandal, not a dirty secret, a mirror. Every time he looked back, he saw the version of himself who had been too afraid to claim what he wanted. The version who chose duty over desire and then spent the rest of his life paying interest on that decision. This is the hidden truth. It was not that he did not love the woman he married. It was that part of him never stopped loving the woman he left behind. The world heard his famous lines, his political speeches, his moral convictions. What it never heard was the apology he never knew how to send. To the girl in the hallway, to the woman in the photograph, to the life that almost was. That apology lived only in the way he held that picture, in the way he kept it when he had thrown so many other things away, in the way his eyes changed when he thought no one was watching. Some ghost scream. This one just looked at him, quietly, from the past. And that was enough to follow him all the way to the end. The biggest shock did not come from Hollywood. It came from a small apartment in Westwood and a phone call no one forgot. Pier Angeli was 39 when they found her. The newspapers wrote the usual words: tragic, sudden, gone too soon. They mentioned the pills, the loneliness, the failed marriage, the career that had never quite matched the promise. What they didn't mention was the name she whispered when the world wasn't listening: Paul. By then, Paul Newman's life looked settled on the surface. He was with Joanne Woodward now. The public had accepted them as a power couple. He was working steadily, becoming the actor critics took seriously. To the world, the story was simple. He had moved on. She had disappeared. But that is not how it felt from the inside. The news reached him between ordinary moments, not on a red carpet, not in a studio, just in a room with a phone and a silence that grew heavier with every word. She's gone. It was an overdose. They think she couldn't bear it anymore. People who were there that day say his face changed, not dramatically. Just a small, almost imperceptible collapse around the eyes, as if a part of him had been expecting this and had spent years praying he was wrong. He did not cry in public. He did not issue a statement. He did what he always did with pain. He went quiet. The biggest shock was not that she died young. Hollywood had seen that pattern before. The real shock was what surfaced after a family member, going through Pier's things, opened a box she had kept hidden in the back of a wardrobe. Inside were letters. Some sent, some never mailed, some written and then crossed out so violently they were almost unreadable. In several of them, one name appeared again and again. Paul Newman, not as a co-star, not as a colleague, as the unfinished sentence in her life. One day I will stop imagining what my life would have been if I had been braver with him, she wrote in one fragment. Today is not that day. According to one friend, there was a photograph tucked between the pages. Not a studio still, not a magazine shot, just a candid picture from a distance. Paul laughing with someone out of frame. His head tilted back, his guard down. On the back, in her handwriting, there were only 2 words, "My mistake." Those letters never became public scandal. They did not hit the tabloids. They did not destroy anyone's image. They did something worse. They confirmed what some people had always suspected. Pier had never really let him go. And somewhere, behind all the careful control, he had never fully let her go either. Years later, a confidant of Paul's would describe a night when her name came up over dinner. Everyone else treated it like trivia, a footnote in cinema history. He did not. She was softer than the world allowed her to be, he said finally. Then he stopped, put down his glass, changed the subject. The man telling the story added one detail. I have seen Paul talk about presidents with more emotion than most people talk about their own parents. But with her, there was something he refused to touch. That's when I understood this wasn't just nostalgia. It was regret. The biggest shock is not that a first love can haunt a man. It is that it can haunt him even when he has everything the world says should cure him. Fame, respect, a long marriage others envy, a purpose larger than himself. None of it erased the knowledge that somewhere back there, in the early quarters of his life, he had turned his back on a woman who had never stopped turning toward him. There is another detail, small, easy to miss. In the years after Pier's death, when Paul Newman began his heavy charity work, he was asked more than once why he gave so much away. Because I've been luckier than I deserved, he would say. And then, almost under his breath, and because you can't buy back what you wasted. No one knew exactly what he meant, but the people who knew about that box of letters thought they did. One story, rarely repeated, says he visited her grave quietly, without cameras, more than once. No entourage, no speeches. Just a man standing in front of a stone with a name he had tried not to think about for years. He stayed for a long time, hands in his pockets, head slightly bowed. A witness, uncomfortable with the intimacy of what he was seeing, walked away before it ended. All he remembered was the way Paul's shoulders looked, not like an icon, not like a movie star, like someone trying to apologize to a past that would never answer. The biggest shock is this. The world built a legend out of Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward, a golden couple, a love that survived decades, a marriage people used as proof that Hollywood could still produce something pure. But behind that golden story, there was another one. A young woman in a foreign country, a man caught between duty and desire, 2 lives that bent away from each other in public and kept circling each other in private memory until the end. He did not destroy his career for her. He did not tear his life apart. He just did nothing. That was the choice. That was the wound, and that is what haunted him. Not the tabloids, not the rumors, not the exaggerated stories people later invented to make sense of the silence. What haunted him was the simple, devastating fact that he had once stood at a crossroads where his heart was clear and his courage was not. She paid the heavier price. She paid with years of disillusionment, with a career that never fully let her be herself, with a sadness that hardened into despair. He paid with something quieter. He got the life that looked right. But every time he opened that drawer and saw her face, he remembered the life that might have been true. That is the biggest shock, not that a love can die, but that it can live on so powerfully in two people and still never be lived at all. By the time he reached his final years, the photograph remained. Old, soft at the edges, handled more times than he would admit. When a friend once asked why he kept it, he gave the safest answer he could think of. Because we were young, he said, and I don't ever want to forget what it feels like to be that stupid. But the look in his eyes told a different story. It wasn't stupidity he was remembering. It was the moment he learned that choosing the right life could still feel, in the deepest part of him, like the wrong decision. And that is a revelation no award, no legacy, no public love story can ever fully cover. In the end, the story of Paul Newman and Pier Angeli is not a scandal. It is a reminder of how quietly a life can break. People imagine tragedy as something loud, a fight, a betrayal, an explosion. But some tragedies happen in silence, in the spaces where decisions are made not with passion, but with fear. Paul lived a long, accomplished life. He built a family, a legacy, and a reputation that outlived him. He became the kind of man others studied, admired, imitated. But every life has a shadow, even one bathed in applause. For Paul, that shadow had a name. A young Italian actress who had once looked at him with a softness he never forgot. A woman whose path split from his because neither of them found the courage to choose anything else. In his final years, he spoke often about responsibility, discipline, integrity, but rarely about longing, rarely about the price of choosing the right life. Yet those who knew him best said there were moments brief, unguarded when the past returned. A photograph slipped from a drawer, a song from a film they once walked past together, a memory surfacing without permission. Regret does not always roar. Sometimes it breathes. Pier became the ghost he carried, not out of guilt for what he did, but for what he didn't do, for the silence he kept, for the door he closed before he knew how heavy it would become. Her life, cut short, became a warning he never voiced publicly, that some hearts do not recover from being almost chosen. And his life, full of triumphs, carried its own quiet message, that duty may build a future, but desire builds the parts of yourself you never stop mourning. The moral is not that he should have run to her, not that he should have abandoned everything. Life is never that simple. The moral is this: when two people recognize each other too deeply, too suddenly, they face a crossroads. One path is safe, predictable, respected. The other is terrifying and true. Most people choose the first, and they spend the rest of their lives wondering about the second. Paul Newman became a legend, but legends are still human. And in the quiet of his final days, when the cameras were gone and the world no longer needed a perfect image, he held on to a single photograph, not because it was proof of a great love, but because it was proof of the love he never dared to live. Some stories end not with a farewell, but with a question that follows a man to his last breath. What if I had chosen differently?